Many so-called independent contractors, they will be eligible for the extended unemployment benefit. That is exactly the right thing. And the other thing that this bill does, which is right, is it says, okay, we are in the midst of a horrific crisis, unprecedented in modern American history. So not only are you going to get your regular unemployment benefits, we're going to add another $600 a week to it. And now I find that some of my Republican colleagues are very distressed. They're very upset that somebody who's making 10, 12 bucks an hour might end up with a paycheck for 4 months more than they received last week. Oh my God, the universe is collapsing. Imagine that. Somebody who's making 12 bucks an hour, now like the rest of us, faces an unprecedented economic crisis with the $600 on top of their regular unemployment check, might be making a few bucks more for 4 months. Oh my word, will the universe survive? How absurd and wrong is that? What kind of value system is that? Meanwhile, these very same folks had no problem a couple of years ago voting for $1 trillion in tax breaks for billionaires and large profitable corporations. Not a problem. But when it comes to low-income workers in the midst of a terrible crisis, maybe some of them earning or having more money than they previously made, oh my word, we got to strip that out. Got to tell those poor people that no matter what. And by the way, when the McConnell bill first came up, unbelievably, and I know many Republicans objected to this, they were saying that, well, we want to give whatever it was, $1,000 or $1,200, but poor people should get less. You see, because poor people are down here, they don't deserve, they don't eat, they don't pay rent, they don't go to the doctor, they're somehow inferior because they're poor, we're going to give them less. Well, that was addressed. Now everybody is going to get the $1,200. But some of my Republican friends still have not given up on the need to punish the poor and working people. You haven't raised the minimum wage in 10 years. Minimum wage should be at least $15 an hour. You haven't done that. You've cut program after program after program, and now, horror of horrors, for 4 months, workers might be earning a few bucks more than they otherwise went. Well, needless to say, this is an amendment that is coming up. I don't think it's going to go very far. And if it does go far, I will introduce an amendment to deal with the corporate welfare, the $500 billion in corporate welfare, which is, to me, a very serious problem. But I do not think they're going to get the 60 votes, and that will be the end of it. Mr. President, this bill also includes some $250 billion in one-time checks of $1,200 for adults and $500 for kids. Now, I have a couple of concerns there. Number one, I have believed that in the midst of this unprecedented crisis, that we should make this a monthly benefit, not a one-time benefit. And depending on what happens, and I expect very much that this Congress will be reconvening, because I think this coronavirus 3, the bill we're on right now, is going to be superseded by a coronavirus 4, because my strong guess is this does not go far enough. But the bill does include a $1,200 check for adults, $500 for kids. That will help in the short term. We've got to do a lot better than that. As many of you know, in countries around the world, UK, Denmark, other countries, the approach that they are taking, which makes sense to me, is to basically say to employers, if you keep your workers on the job, even if they're not working right now, we will pay, in the UK case, 80% of their salary. Other countries a bit higher. I think that is the direction we should have gone. This is a little bit more convoluted. But what we do here is give $367 billion in loans to small businesses, and those loans could be forgiven if those small businesses don't lay off workers. And I think for a variety of reasons that is exactly the right thing to do. The goal right now is to stabilize the economy by telling workers that they will have their jobs when they come back, when this thing is over, and that in the meantime, they will have all or most of their income. That is my preferred approach. This bill provides $150 billion to states and cities, and I can tell you that in Vermont, and I'm sure in every other state in this country, states and cities are hurting because we all know there has been a major decline in tax revenue, and that is an important thing to do because, by the way, in the midst of this crisis, a lot of the responsibility is going to fall on local and state government. And one of the concerns of many that I have about this bill is that in the best of times, this bill requires an enormous amount of work by the federal, state, and local governments. How do you get all these on? And it is going to take an enormous amount of work to make sure that the money goes where it should go in a cost-effective way. This bill does a lot of other things as well that I think will help the American economy. So to conclude, Mr. President, this is not the bill that I would have written. Frankly, I don't think it's the bill that most Americans would have written. I think most Americans are very, very apprehensive that 1/4 of this bill is going to go to large corporations with very little accountability. And in a political season, let me make the radical suggestion that we have a president of the United States who may end up targeting some of this money to states that he needs to win. So this bill has some good things and has some issues of real concern, but one thing we must not do is to punish low-income workers who might get a few bucks more than they previously earned. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Nebraska.
I've just listened to the senator from Vermont's speech, and there's obviously a lot we don't agree on in life and policy, politics, and economics. He caricatured the entire purpose of this amendment tonight. The purpose of this amendment tonight is to affirm work. Under his vision, I don't know exactly where he thinks the workers who stock shelves and drive trucks right now would come from, because he made an argument about government subsidies that would be on a permanent basis higher than the wages of all those jobs. So I don't understand how his economic system would ever actually work, but I'd actually like to just praise him here. Two things. One, he said something that the politicians usually don't say. Usually when people are going to vote for something, they say the bill's salvific and utopian and going to do everything right. And if they're going to vote against something, they say it's the worst thing that's ever been written. And Senator Sanders just said that this bill has a lot in it. It's big, it's clunky, we're in the middle of a national emergency, and there's some good and there's some bad in it, and he's going to vote for it. I also believe this bill is big and clunky and stinky. There's a lot that's broken in it. There's some that's good and urgent and necessary and important, and there's a lot that's bad and poorly thought out and not going to be implemented very effectively. And on that, I'm also inclined to vote for it. So I appreciate his candor in admitting that this is kind of a big crap sandwich. But in addition, I want to praise the senator from Vermont for his candor in saying something that I totally oppose, but I appreciate his integrity and honesty in admitting it. He said, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, sir, please, he said he wishes the $1,200 monthly payment would be made, or the $1,200 emergency payment would be made monthly and permanent. Is that right?
No, not permanent, but during the crisis, yes.
Okay, that's helpful clarification. You were saying a lot of different things, and I thought you were arguing for a UBI of 14 grand. So I just wanted to clarify that point, but I appreciate the fact that you believe a lot of things very differently. The senator believes, speaking in the third person, a lot of things very differently than I do, but he argues forcefully for his positions. And I think that this body would benefit from more people who spoke as bluntly and directly as the senator from Vermont. I hope his positions are voted down again and again and again and again, but I appreciate the way he argues for his positions. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon.
President, several senators on the other side have been arguing against the provision in this bill to supercharge unemployment insurance right now, something that Senate Democrats have negotiated with the Trump administration, Secretary Mnuchin, and Chairman Grassley. Based on what I'm hearing from senators on the other side, you'd think that this provision was pretty much going to end Western civilization. Now, supercharging unemployment benefits has long been a priority for Senate Democrats, and we've been fighting for those improvements in unemployment since the process began. In our view, it's the key to getting help to where...
Senator from Oregon,
Yes.
would you please use your microphone?
Thank the President.
Certainly.
Supercharging unemployment benefits has long been something Senate Democrats have been fighting for. It's the key to getting help where it's needed most. And believe me, colleagues, when you see the unemployment claim numbers tomorrow, if the numbers are accurate, this chamber is going to see that the unemployment crisis is exploding in America. I don't believe anybody in our great country should fall into destitution as a result of this pandemic. So I obviously disagree with my colleagues who oppose our amendment so strongly to improve unemployment benefits. I just want to make a few key points in response to their argument. First, I want to start with an argument I heard that just about knocked the wind out of me when I heard it earlier. It's the idea that nurses are going to quit their jobs as a result of this legislation. Mr. President, nurses are not going to be quitting their jobs to get unemployment benefits because that's not how nurses think when they get up in the morning. By now, everyone has seen the Herculean efforts of our nurses fighting the pandemic. Nurses in America are brave. They care. They're the true professionals. From Portland, Oregon to Portland, Maine, they're on the front lines of this fight, putting themselves in harm's way to save the lives of our neighbors, whether it's in South Carolina, Oregon, or anywhere else. They don't cut and run. In contrary to the suggestion of my colleague from Nebraska, retired nurses have been coming out of retirement in droves to help treat patients who are suffering because of the coronavirus. Second, it's a head-scratcher to me that my colleague from Nebraska is raising this objection now. I'm the ranking Democrat in the Finance Committee. I learned about his objection when I watched the press conference, and then I called him about it. The proposal's been out there for days. Senators have known about it the whole time. It's not a drafting error. It's not a last-minute surprise. What the senator from Nebraska wants to, in effect, drop now was part of the bill. And Mr. President, you're a member of our committee, and I enjoy working with you. What the senator from Nebraska wants to drop now, in fact, was part of the bill that Republican leader McConnell introduced on Saturday. He introduced it on Saturday because Senate Democrats insisted on it being part of the package. And as Secretary Mnuchin said this afternoon on national television, we all heard it, Republicans agreed. I'll have a little more to say about Secretary Mnuchin's remarks in a minute. Third, I want to talk about why this is so needed. why my Democratic colleagues and I have worked so hard to help the millions hit by this economic wrecking ball get through these horrendous times. For most Americans, the old unemployment rules would cover only a third to half of their lost wages. That's it. Pretty hard to pay the rent, put food on the table with that. Even before this crisis, Mr. President, the Federal Reserve found that nearly half of Americans wouldn't have been able to come up with $400 cash to cover costs in an emergency. So let's face it, millions of Americans were walking on an economic tightrope, balancing their rent against their food and the food against the fuel, and that was before the pandemic. That's why we on our side feel so strongly, so appreciative of the work of Senator Peters, Senator Menendez, who helped in the negotiations, and of course, the leader. We all said we need an improved supercharged unemployment benefit to replace people's lost wages. Those are people who shouldn't face a choice between homelessness, hunger, or bankruptcy because a virus has shut down our economy and cost them their job. This isn't the fault of any workers in South Carolina or Oregon or anywhere else. And while the consumer economy is shuttered, the Congress has a responsibility to make sure that Americans can bounce back in a matter of weeks or months. Otherwise, millions are going to struggle slowly to recover from the economic crisis, and many might not make it if the Senate doesn't move to help them now. Now. The panic people feel over the virus is already too much, and the least we can do as lawmakers is to have their backs when it comes to surviving this economic crisis. Now, all my colleagues know we're on the third bill in the fight against the virus. Mitch McConnell's first version of this bill did virtually nothing for those who are losing their jobs. I read it carefully. Out of 247 pages in the Republican leader's first bill, 8 lines of text, not 8 pages, 8 lines, and those 8 lines only dealt with filing for unemployment online. Now, that bill had an awful lot of corporate goodies, lots of slush funds for big corporations, but just a few measly lines for people hurting, for workers hurting, workers losing their jobs. Senate Democrats fought for and won changes that make up this robust, expanded, supercharged program of unemployment insurance. It's based on a bill that our colleague Senator Peters and I introduced not long ago. First, in these punishing economic times, Americans are going to need more weeks of coverage than they would otherwise get from unemployment insurance. The existing length of unemployment benefits will not cover the time this crisis will last. Second, the Senate needed to modernize the unemployment insurance program because it really hasn't changed much since it was developed in Wisconsin in 1932. Mr. President, 1932, nobody was talking about gig workers. And that unemployment program that was invented then hadn't changed all that much. Certainly hasn't been built to take on the kind of challenge our country faces right now. Democratic senators and I looked at that system and said this old system wouldn't be good enough for independent contractors, the self-employed, gig workers, part-time workers, and freelancers. They're a big part of the face of the modern economy. They weren't the kind of workers anybody was thinking about in 1932 when the program was invented. Senate Democrats led the effort to get those people coverage, and I'm glad that at one point in the negotiations, we could get bipartisan support for it. For people who still have their jobs but have their hours slashed, we're going to bat for them. For people in the service economy, restaurants, salons, gyms, you name it. All those people who are suffering because their jobs and their businesses have been put on pause, we're going to bat for them. We're talking about millions and millions of Americans, people who are looking at hard times ahead, and they need our help now. The old unemployment insurance system wasn't working, so Senate Democrats said, we're going to come together and we're going to go to bat for all those independent contractors and the self-employed and the freelancers and the gig workers. And now I think not only are we going to help them over the next 4 months, but I think we have developed some ideas that can be part of reforming the unemployment compensation system after those 4 months. Now, I want to turn to why this agreement raises benefits specifically by $600 per month. I've heard my colleagues and their strenuous objections to that amount. The reason it is $600, Mr. President, is because Labor Secretary Scalia, after meeting with the Senate negotiators, myself, Senator Grassley, Secretary Mnuchin, Senator Menendez, Senator Portman, big group of us. Secretary Scalia, after meeting with Senate negotiators, left us with no other way to get benefits to workers quickly. Secretary Scalia said that the states had no other way to get the benefits to workers in time. We needed a simple solution. And I know my colleague, the distinguished President of the Senate, and others who are sponsoring this proposal to unravel what Senate Democrats did with Secretary Mnuchin, the Trump administration, and Chairman Grassley may not believe me, but I want to share the words of Secretary Mnuchin himself, and specifically on this question of why we were focused on making sure that workers could get that extra $600 a week. Just today, Secretary Mnuchin said, and I'm going to quote here, most of these state systems have technology that's 30 years old or older. If we had the ability to customize this with much more specifics, we would have. This was the only way we could ensure states could get the money out quickly and in a fair way, so we used $600 across the board. I don't think it will create incentives. Most Americans want what they want. They want to keep their jobs. That is what Secretary Mnuchin said today in defending the language that is in the bill as, in effect, the fastest, simplest way for workers to get their benefits, and why we disagree so strongly with the amendment from the senator from Nebraska to unravel that approach. The math shows that a standard payment of $600 is the simplest way to get to full wage replacement without causing, as of now, an administrative train wreck. So I'm going to close on this. I'm sure that everybody here read that unemployment claims are expected to go up by $2.5 million in 1 week when the statistics are released tomorrow. Let me say that again, 2.5 million. That's almost as many jobs that were lost in the entire year of 2008 when the Great Recession hit our country so hard. It's the single largest rise in unemployment since that figure began to be tracked. 12 entire months worth of Great Recession job losses. That's how many unemployment claims economists expect to see in a single week. This country has never faced anything like it. It's not a normal recession. This isn't a normal bill to try to stimulate the economy in which the government tries to give the economy a shot of fiscal adrenaline. This is a time when we face a shutdown of entire sectors of our economy. What the Congress needs to do is keep our economy alive and act now. We're not going to do that by shortchanging workers who are losing drafting error. It didn't pop out at the last minute. It's not going to bring about the end of Western civilization. I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will review what Secretary Mnuchin had to say this afternoon on national television, supporting what Democrats, Senate Democrats, negotiated with him and the administration, and join us in making sure millions and millions of Americans don't fall into destitution. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. President. I don't wish to delay things, but I just want to make a couple of comments. I did speak earlier this afternoon about this. It's almost an understatement to say that America's at an inflection point. We're facing a public health crisis unlike any we've seen in generations. Governments at every level, state, local, county, are racing to respond, react, and mitigate the crisis. Hospital systems are soon going to be overrun if they have not already been. The package here is a good one. Does it do everything? No. Is it perfect? No. But is it a lot better where we were? Yes. I think of the Senate as a body that should be the conscience of the nation. And it's time for us to have reality trump rhetoric. We've had enough rhetoric. Let's have something that pass that speaks to reality. I think of our own governor, Republican governor, who has worked so hard to help our state. This will give him some tools, as it will to our Speaker of the House and our President pro tem of our legislature. But with this bill, we support the victims of this terrible virus, the healthcare providers and first responders on the front lines tending to their care, the essential workers that are keeping our stores shelves stocked and necessities available, the families hit by the fallout from this pandemic. I have been fortunate. Been married now for almost 58 years to the best medical surgical nurse I've ever known. I hear her tell what it is. Marcel tells me what the doctors and nurses face in a situation like this. Mr. President, I pray that neither you nor I nor any other member of this body would have to face what they face on the front lines. We should go forward and pass this bill. I'd ask that my full statement be included in the record.
Without objection.
I yield the floor. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Mr. President.
Senator from Maine.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that proceedings under the call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I see that the senator from Maryland is on the floor, and I think he arrived a minute or two before me, so if he'd like to go first, I would want to give him that opportunity.
I'm grateful, thank you, Senator from Maine, but I'm happy to have you go first.
Thank you. Mr. President, all across the country, Americans are stepping up in response to the coronavirus pandemic sweeping our nation. Doctors and nurses are working endless hours and putting themselves at risk to care for the surge in patients. Manufacturers, including many companies in my state, are working overtime and retooling their product lines to produce medical testing swabs, ventilators, and personal protective equipment, all of which are vitally needed. Truckers are going above and beyond, missing time with their families so that they can deliver goods needed to restock depleted grocery shelves. People are looking out for their neighbors in a safe way. They're checking on them. They're making personal sacrifices to help prevent the virus from spreading to the most vulnerable members of our society. Help is on the horizon for small businesses and their employees who are facing economic devastation through no fault of their own. Mr. President, I have talked to small business owners all across our state, including small mom-and-pop operations like a third-generation diner operated and owned by the Simonis family in Lewiston, Maine. For the first time ever in 3 generations, they have had to close their doors. They've had no choice. As Linda Simonis told me in tears earlier this week, we've never been unemployed. Our son is unemployed. Our friends who have worked with us at this diner for years are unemployed. Mr. President, the agreement finally reached today includes a $377